holding a blank piece of paper, and the police accosted it, not on the basis of anything that was written on it, but what might be written. And I think that one of the things about posters is not just what's on the poster itself, but actually what's in the mind of the viewer. Because they're all, to a large extent, about projections that we put on the information. And the information there is, in a sense, a stimulus. Over the years, I used to make lots of posters. I don't really very much now, but I kind of somehow accumulated a huge archive because we used to exchange posters with each other. So I just brought, I thought I'd bring 10, and I couldn't help myself, but there's lots more. I'll try to go through them kind of quickly, and try to tell a sort of story. One of the things that was kind of the invitation was because Adam and Lily were looking at community print shops. And so I kind of said, well, talked about some of the things we did. This is Paul Peter P. She was an American artist working in the 60s and 70s. And I kind of thought that it was kind of apposite that print studios in the 70s, which I was part of, were part of an idea that needed to have time to come. I advertised this, though, as get off my cloud, on the basis that I think a lot of protest posters do say precisely that. And this is an American artist called Fabiana Rodriguez. And I thought some of the best examples of, hey, you get off my cloud, that I'm kind of aware of. I'm going to spread posters around so that you can kind of catch up, and if you've got dirty hands, don't touch them. Please don't steal them, they're the only ones I've got. This was a kind of personal get off my cloud, because in the early 70s, the National Front started doing lots of work around the Harrow Road where I was kind of operating. And people came to me and they said, John, make a poster that will make the National Front go away. And so I kind of thought of an image that looked really industrial and really kind of authoritarian. And so that was my version of Get Off of My Cloud for the National Front, which kind of became a local sort of, yeah, it went up the way. There's a book, Paddington Print Shop Posters, by me and other people, published by Four Corners Print, only £15, very quick, reasonable. You can get it on the internet, probably. I wanted to talk about some of the kind of influences. This is a print from Posada, who's an American, Mexican poster maker, printmaker. This is the skeleton of Don Quixote. But Posada, and in the kind of 30s and 40s, or just after the Mexican Revolution, there was a huge drive of artists to become engaged socially, and that was supported by the government. And people like Posada really sort of worked in satirical prints and became, I think, kind of a sort of strong influence. So here there are various other examples of get off of my cloud. This is people protesting against the construction of a metro going through the middle of Amsterdam in the mid-70s. This is the sort of thing I'm sure you kind of remember. Other examples of get off of my cloud related to our relationship with Northern Ireland. What was interesting is that these kind of posters sprang up almost spontaneously, kind of around the world. This is Australian print studio, kind of, and this is again kind of 70s, asking for a nuclear-free Pacific. And it's amazing, sort of, how the issues never change. This is going back to the 70s, obviously kind of French. Maybe you know this kind of story, but in kind of May 68, there's a kind of, sort of bit of a hoo-ha in Paris. And one of the biggest kind of influences of people who make posters like me after 68 was the Atelier Populaire, which was the art students basically who occupied the fine art department, and another group who occupied the Polytechnic. And I tell you popular stories about the art students who kind of occupied the art department and made lots of posters, which you probably know, sort of battles of the police or images of the goal. And many people think that it stopped there, but actually the group that operated in the Polytechnic continued and became a kind of studio called Graduates. And they continued on for kind of many years and did sort of the most amazing kind of posters. Many of them for kind of the French state. Some more examples of Get Off of My Cloud. These are kind of a group operating in London in the 70s called Poster Film Collective that had a very kind of international focus, particularly in kind of liberation struggles around the world. But also kind of, this is kind of going back to the kind of early 70s, the death of, or almost the death of Franco, where there were arms kind of carrying on within Europe. We tend to forget this kind of thing as well. Not screen print, but I thought a kind of reminder of what those times were like in the most extreme and the way in which some people protected particular kinds of plans against other people. So kind of, I advertised it as celebration and protest. And then when I looked through the ones I selected, there was hardly any celebration. So I'll come to that at the end. There is a bit of a cheerful note, I promise. I kind of sort of thought, where did this kind of begin? What was the kind of momentum? And in a sense, one very, very strong momentum was the Russian Revolution got into bed, the Bolsheviks got into bed with the avant-garde for a very brief period. They then kicked out and shot them and made them run away to other places. But there was a brief period where there was a kind of love affair that went on. And in fact, the early Russian state set up kind of lots of museums of modern art, long before any Western places. This is not original, but it's kind of very typical of the kind of propaganda stuff that people make. And it's very, very simple stencil. And this is done by Rostock, which is the Telegraph and Postal Service, which kind of organized massive kind of postal distribution. But they sort of encouraged avant-garde artists to participate, or the avant-garde through itself in the revolution for a 10-year period. But I think that was a very, very strong influence of the stencil, because if all you've got is a piece of paper and a brush and something to cut out, actually that technology can belong to anyone. You don't need kind of hugely elaborate sort of printing process. So I promised Adam that I would bring a very early stencil, because when we started the print studio, we started in an exhibition in the Royal College celebrating Chilean culture, and in opposition to the coup that happened the year before. We set up a print studio in the gallery, kind of working with the public, kind of the way the guys have been doing here, but that was 74. Just kind of, in a sense, that kind of internationalism of all this. This is kind of workers' rights from Johannesburg. Again, kind of operating under so suddenly in the 70s, there are all of these print studios suddenly kind of spring up, almost magically. This was me, and the one with the white hair. You might know. Advertising, kind of, come and make your posters at Paddington Print Shop. And there were another workshop, another London workshop, a women's workshop in Lenthal Road, in London, Islington bus companies, and, there were hundreds of these suddenly sprung up. A French studio in Holland, another one in Bath. And this is much later, but this is New Zealand, where another print studio who had very much the same kind of philosophy. We won't work for you, we'll work with you, which I think is kind of what many of us kind of felt. And, I didn't sign any of this stuff. It took me 40 years to even put a name to them and say, we kind of had this collective illusion. There was also a kind of breach in kind of the left's kind of visual iconography, the kinds of images that the left used, which happens in the Russian Revolution. If you look at the first few posters that the Bolsheviks do, they're very 19th century. And then when the avant-garde comes in, it all changes. But much of the left, even into the 70s, kind of was still going with this kind of very 19th century kind of way of, this is the International Marxist Group, Marxist-Leninist tendency. At the 70s. It's remarkable, actually, how the issues haven't changed that much. But I think me and my colleagues were very much not interested in that kind of didactic graphics. Partly because, like the bit of paper, it didn't give any space for people to actually engage and imagine things themselves. Another kind of strong influence was kind of people like Hartfield's, some Dadaists who used photocollage and created very, very powerful images that didn't necessarily need words, just by juxtaposing kind of cut-up collage photos. So Hartfield's working kind of just before the Second World War. He fled to England, where one of the greatest propagandists against Nazism was interned in a camp by the English on the basis that he was German. This is kind of work in the kind of late 70s, early 80s by an English group. It's Peter Dunn, Lorraine, released in 82. And this is all about the development of documents. That kind of more poetic language is a German poster protesting against the development of an airport again, local people saying, not in my backyard, but I think that's beautiful. Though after 9/11, we see this illustrated. It has to be said. The kind of things I used to put out. Stop police repression as a plan. It actually wasn't protesting. Police were beating up the town in front of a group of kids. It was joking. Or one that became much more famous in terms of a local housing campaign.
This one's really incredible, like the story of the role of the poster in the housing campaigns in the 80s in this neighbourhood. I don't know if it was like a condensed version of that story, but I think that
I think what happened was that there was a local estate, 1,000 housing units. The Conservative Council tried to sell the whole thing off because they thought that if they could sell council houses, they could attract Conservative voters. There was a long protracted struggle over 6 years where the council did no repairs. The tenants formed their own housing association. They bid to take over the estate, and actually, because there'd been no repairs done, they were given the estate for free, plus 16 million pounds. This was 84? No, 89. Angela will probably remember the exact date.
They're still there.
They're still there today. It's still going strong. And the poster's kind of memorable, but actually what people did was probably much more memorable. I talked about the kind of the Bolsheviks getting in bed with the kind of avant-garde. It happened again in Cuba. David probably may correct me on this, but my understanding is that just after the revolution, the main advertising agency, whose name escapes me, which is always embarrassing when I face so many people, actually went over to the revolution, and they brought kind of a lot of pop kind of influences, and there's kind of the kind of pop culture that kind of people sort of associate with Cuba, either in terms of cinema or kind of in terms of international kind of propaganda. But actually, here's some real treasures. We'd never see out of Cuba, because this is the sort of thing that went on internally. Moncada was a battle very, very early on, before the revolution. It was the first time the guerrillas really came out and had a scrap with the Batista government. And it became immortalized as part of their revolution. But this kind of, tells people to kind of go forward in production in the spirit of the attack on the barracks. Or kind of how to kind of, you must improve the tobacco yield. This is the kind of thing that will be going on internally, or will be more efficient and careful with the oil. Tell me if you're getting tired. This is posted by Martin Walker Bernadette Britton, who did a lot of sporting posters in the 70s. But you can kind of see the influence of the kind of Cuban style, the kind of pop style, which is so very, very different from what had been traditional on the left. Martin was actually thrown out of one organisation, one print studio, for using too many colours. Because in the left, at that time, for many people, there were only two colours, and they were black and red. So there were kind of lots of arguments about kind of being associated with many colours. I sort of said that some of the people who'd been active in Mason Theatre had kind of been to Poland, and Polish graphics did have a sort of extraordinary influence, because there was a school of poetic image making that was taught kind of within Warsaw. And I think you get the kind of idea of kind of the nature of the poetry by these kind of posters. Most people kind of could only make posters for theatre or circus or that kind of thing. There was no kind of political outlet. And so people actually, they were faced with a censor who was Polish and probably not entirely antagonistic to people's ideas. And so people developed a way of creating a sort of subterfuge. This says circus, but actually, so this is long before Solidarity. This is kind of early 70s, and is a very strong political poster in that what it's saying is, actually we're living in a circus and we're tightly bound and we're repressed. It's the same person who did the image of the guy with the blank black eye.
Sorry, what's the word of this?
Circus.
Circus.
Yeah. So if you were in Poland at that time, you would see lots of adverts for circus, but they would all be jolly. Whereas this was quite the opposite, and was calling the regime a circus. No?
Well, I think it's a product of its time, isn't it?
It's very much a product of its time. What these people didn't have access to printing presses. That was controlled. And so this work was done with a sponge and a paper stencil. So he would cut paper stencils and have a dry sponge and build up the images like that. Yeah. So again, going back to that kind of very, very early idea of making stencils.
Sorry, what is this one about?
This one?
Last one, yeah, what's that?
Oh, that is it's for theatre. So it's not a political poster, but it is a bit frightening. Typical of the kind of way that sort of French graphics kind of implemented the same kind of sort of poetry in terms of its iconography. This isn't a May 68 poster, but is very much in the style of the kind of May 68 posters. One group that kind of, I didn't think I had in here, and the normal, yes, I did. I thought this was kind of interesting. I do have all sorts of other posters in my archive, but this is a normal commercial poster of the day. And I think what's kind of really amazing about it is it's telling you that if you eat and drink with a tankard, you will exert powerful influence over women. But it's that kind of advertising which sort of led lots of women to form their own workshops. And these are some posters from a group called Sea Red that was kind of active around London as a feminist workshop in the kind of 70s. And there is also a really good book published by the same people who published the Paddington Crenshaw one on their posters. And there were kind of very much extols people to kind of go against the dominant advertising. And it has this kind of very nice homespun kind of imagery. Very much actually for domestic consumption. So these posters didn't go on the screen. They would be posters that people put in their kitchens and their living rooms. There's some more about that. What really struck me when I looked back at my advertising poster and said, and celebration, is I kind of came up against this one, which was, it is a benefit. It is a benefit role for a group known as the Stoke Community 5, otherwise known as the Angry Brigade. And it was a group of people who were put on trial, some of whom went to prison for a long time, for kind of sort of violent kind of uprising. So they did let off a couple of bombs as part of the kind of imitation of the Red Brigade or the Garden Life. But there are some celebrations. You may know Meanwhile Gardens. This is the first poster advertising Meanwhile Gardens when Jamie McCulloch had decided that he'd like to try to turn some wasteland in West London into a public park. And Jamie was a friend, and we kind of worked together on that project. And then later,
It's still there as well.
it is still there as well. And Steve even made a film of it in the 1980s, which is still on YouTube. And of course, we did lots of events there and posters, kind of. So this is where you can see Joe Strummer for 25 quid. And the legs are squashes back. I'm almost there. You don't have to stay around for much longer. One of the things that sort of happened, I think, to lots of people was that, you know, I started out on the street and ended up with a gallery. It was never intended to be that way. But also, artists kind of moved into other spaces, and they moved into sort of gallery spaces. One of the sort of really powerful kind of poster movements was in South Africa and Namibia. And in particular, an artist called John Phillips, who did very, very simple lino cut. And then a whole school of kind of artists began to use this kind of technique. And I thought this was really interesting, because this is what you can do without any resources whatsoever. This is done by cutting cardboard and printing off the raised cardboard. These guys didn't even have line. And they're printing with gloss paint and using a sack just filled with sand as their printing. I thought that was kind of really nice example. And here, particularly in Chicano culture, kind of lots of artists kind of use poster work and kind of poster graphics taking it into kind of fine art